The mud is cold against a man's chest and it does not warm. That is the first thing. On the central plain of Luzon, in the last hour of daylight on the 30th of January 1945, 121 American soldiers lie face down in a drainage ditch, and the mud does not warm no matter how long they press into it. It has held the day's rain, and now it holds them. Beside them and behind them, spread through the tall carabao grass along the same shallow cut in the earth, lie the Filipino fighters of 2 guerrilla squadrons, the men of Juan Pajota and Eduardo Joson. Perhaps 200, perhaps more, threaded into the darkness so quietly that a ranger 3 feet away can hear another man's breathing but cannot always see his shape. Less than a mile ahead, across an open field of dry-season stubble that offers no cover at all, stands the front gate of the Cabanatuan prisoner of war camp. Behind that gate, inside the wire, are roughly 511 men, Americans mostly, survivors of Bataan and of Corregidor. Men who have been inside that place for nearly 3 years, who have starved and sickened and watched their friends die by the hundred, and who do not yet know that the strange stillness of this evening, the way the guards keep glancing at the sky, has anything to do with them. It is approximately 1900 hours, 7 o'clock. The light is failing fast, the way it always fails fast this close to the equator, the sun dropping without ceremony behind the Zambales Range far to the west, and the plain going from gold to grey to nothing in the space of a few minutes. With the dark comes the noise, not human noise. The men in the ditch make almost none of that, but the enormous layered racket of the tropics after sundown. Insects, first and loudest, a wall of sound rising out of the grass and the flooded paddies, a chorus so dense it seems to press against the eardrum. Frogs somewhere close, the occasional low, wet complaint of a water buffalo tethered in a distant field. And under all of it, faint on the wind, the ordinary sounds of a working camp, a truck engine, a voice raised in a language none of the Americans speak, the metallic clank of something being set down on something else. The smell is the second thing a man notices, after the cold of the mud. Wet grass, bruised where 100 bodies have crushed it flat, giving off a green vegetal sweetness. Standing water, mud with the faint iron tang of the paddies, sweat and the gun oil worked into rifles and carbines and Browning automatic rifles, and the particular smell of nervous men held motionless too long. Somewhere the sweetness of the carabao grass and somewhere the rot underneath it. Because this is farmland that has been fought over and neglected, and the land remembers what has happened here. They cannot leave. That is the thing to understand about the men in this ditch. They have come 30 miles behind Japanese lines to reach this spot, and every mile of it has been witnessed. The march out from the staging town of Guimba took them across open country and through barrios where the roads were lined with Filipino farmers and their families, people who came out to watch the Americans pass, who knew exactly who these tall, sunburnt men were and where they must be going, because there was only one thing 30 miles into occupied territory worth going toward. Word travels in occupied country. It travels along footpaths and across rice-check dikes and from cooking fire to cooking fire faster than any radio. The raiders have been seen by too many eyes now to turn back and hope the enemy never learns they came. Their only protection, from this hour forward, is that no one hears them and no one sees them until the precise instant they choose to be seen. Silence is the whole of their armour. A cough, a rifle bolt worked too loudly, a boot heel on a stone. Any of it could carry across that open field to the guard towers and end 511 lives along with their own. So they lie in the mud, and they do not speak above a breath, and they wait for a signal that has not yet come. And to understand how they arrived at this ditch, how 121 men came to be lying a mile from a fortified enemy camp, with their lives balanced on the edge of a whisper, it is necessary to go back 48 hours and 30 miles to a schoolhouse courtyard in the town of Guimba. 2 days earlier, on the 28th of January, the man who had brought them all to this moment stood in front of them and asked them to swear an oath. His name was Henry Mucci. Lieutenant Colonel Henry A. Mucci, commander of the 6th Ranger Battalion, and by every account of the men who served under him, he was a figure who seemed to have been designed for exactly this kind of scene. He was 32 years old. He was a graduate of West Point, compact and physically tireless, and he had a flair for the dramatic that some officers might have found embarrassing in themselves, and that Mucci wore openly, deliberately, as a tool of command. He smoked a pipe. He wore a pearl-handled pistol on his hip. He drove his Rangers up and down the hills of New Guinea until men fell out from the heat, and then drove the ones who remained harder still, because he believed, with a conviction that was more than half showmanship and more than half genuine, that soft men died and hard men lived, and that his job was to send home as many living men as he possibly could. At Guimba, in the courtyard of a Philippine schoolhouse, with the dust of the plain hanging in the late afternoon light, Mucci gathered his Rangers and the 14 Alamo Scouts who would go in ahead of them, and he told them what they were going to do. He did not soften it. He told them that the men they were going to reach had been in that camp for nearly 3 years, beaten, starved, worked, and left to die of diseases that would have been trivial to cure anywhere with a functioning hospital. He told them that this was not a raid. A raid was a thing you did to destroy something and then leave. This, he said, was a rescue, and the difference was everything, because in a raid the objective was the target, and in a rescue the objective was the men, and you could not, leave the men. The words that survive from that speech have the cadence of a man who knew he was speaking to be remembered. Remember, he told them, these boys have been in that hellhole, beaten and starved for nearly 3 years. If they can't walk to the river, we will carry them. We don't leave one of them behind. Not a single one. And then, folding the whole weight of it into a benediction, go with God and bring our boys home. And then he made them swear. The men knelt. Rangers and Scouts, in a schoolhouse courtyard on the far side of the war, went down onto the packed earth, and Mucci, this pipe-smoking West Pointer with the pearl handles on his .45, whose faith the men who knew him insisted was entirely sincere, led them in prayer and required of each of them an oath, not merely to do their best, not merely to try. He required them to swear that they would die fighting before they would let one of those prisoners be lost, that if it came to it, they would give their own lives to carry another man's out of that camp. It was an extraordinary thing to ask of soldiers, and it was more extraordinary that they gave it, and the giving of it changed the character of everything that came after. There was a hard, practical intelligence buried inside the theatre. Mucci understood something about men under fire that not every commander grasped, that a soldier will do almost anything to avoid breaking faith with the men beside him and with a promise he has made out loud. By making the rescue an oath rather than an order, he converted a mission into a matter of personal honour for every man present. An order can be reconsidered under fire. An order can be second-guessed when the bullets start and the calculus of survival reasserts itself. An oath, sworn on your knees before God and your comrades, is much harder to abandon. Mucci had, in a single afternoon, welded 121 individual survival instincts into one collective refusal to fail. Captain Robert Prince, the young officer who had actually drawn up the tactical plan for the assault, the man who would, in a little over an hour from this moment in the ditch, be the one to give the signal, understood exactly what his colonel was doing, and it did not diminish his loyalty in the slightest. Prince saw the performance for what it was and followed it anyway. We knew he was selling us the blue sky, Prince would say of Mucci long afterward, but we would have followed him anywhere. That single sentence holds the whole of it. The men knew. They were not fools. They were hardened soldiers who had seen enough of war to recognize a leader's theatrics when they were being played, and knowing, they went anyway, because Mucci had made the going into a thing larger than themselves. But an oath is a promise, and a promise raises a question, and the question hung over the whole enterprise like the humidity over the plain. Was it achievable, or was it reckless? Was Mucci asking his men to swear to something that could not, in the physical world of tired bodies and enemy guns and 30 miles of open country, actually be done? Because the truth was that the hardest part of this mission would not be the shooting. The shooting, however terrible, would last only minutes. The hard part, the part that no amount of courage could simply overpower, was the men themselves, the men in the cages, and what condition they were in. To grasp the weight of Mucci's promise, one has to understand precisely who was waiting behind that wire and what state those men were in. Camp Pangatian, the camp the world would come to call Cabanatuan, after the nearby town, held on that evening roughly 511 Allied prisoners. They were the remnant. They were what was left of the men who had surrendered on Bataan in April of 1942 and on the fortress island of Corregidor a month later, the men who had endured the death march that followed the fall of Bataan and then the camps, and then nearly 3 years of a captivity engineered, whether by policy or by neglect the effect was the same, to grind human beings down to nothing. They were starving, not hungry, starving in the clinical sense, in the sense that the body begins to consume itself. Many of them weighed under 100 pounds. Men who had gone into captivity as fit young soldiers, 160, 180 pounds of muscle, were now skeletal, their skin drawn tight over the architecture of their bones, their eyes enormous in shrunken faces. The diseases of deprivation had settled into them and never left. Malaria, which came in cycles of chills and fever that left a man shaking and soaked. Dysentery, which killed slowly and without dignity, wasting a man from the inside until there was nothing left to waste. And beriberi, the disease of vitamin deficiency, of a diet that was mostly a little dirty rice and almost nothing else, which swelled some men's bodies grotesquely with fluid and left others' limbs so weak and wasted that they simply could not make them work. The prisoners had a bitter name for one form of it. They called it I can't, because that was what the disease did. It took away a man's ability to move and left him lying where he was, saying those 2 words to anyone who tried to help him up. I can't. One survivor, a prisoner named Bob Body, would put the whole of it into a single phrase that no medical description improves upon. The camp, he said, was a pathological museum. Every disease of malnutrition and neglect, every wasting condition and tropical infection, displayed in living men, arranged in the barracks like exhibits of what a human being can be reduced to, and still, somehow, remain alive. Some of these men could walk, some, the stronger ones, the ones whose luck or constitution had carried them this far in slightly better shape, could stand and move under their own power, and would be able, if they were freed, to walk out through the gate and keep walking. But many could not. Many could not rise from where they lay without help. Many could not have covered 100 yards, let alone the 30 miles of open, enemy-held country that lay between the wire and safety. And this fact, this brute physical fact about the bodies of the men they had sworn to save, was the central problem of the entire mission, the fact around which everything else had to be arranged. The extraordinary thing, the thing that separates this operation from a reckless lunge into the dark, is that the men lying in the ditch already knew it. They knew, in advance and in detail, that a large number of the prisoners would have to be carried. They were not going to discover this problem when they got inside the wire and it was too late to solve. They knew it now, lying in the mud, because the eyes of the operation had already gone in and come back and told them. Those eyes belonged to the Alamo Scouts, and above all to a lieutenant named Bill Nellist. The Alamo Scouts were a small elite reconnaissance unit, men trained to go deep into enemy territory in tiny teams, to observe, to count, to measure, and to come back alive with the truth. For the Cabanatuan mission they had gone in ahead of the main force, and Nellist and his men had done something close to audacious. Disguised as local farmers, Nellist and Private First Class Rufo Vaquilar among them, moving in the clothing and the manner of the Filipino peasants who work these fields every day, they had approached the camp in the open, in daylight, hidden by nothing but their disguise and their nerve. They had reached an abandoned Nepa hut, a farmer's shack of woven palm and bamboo, that stood in the field somewhere between 200 and 300 yards from the wire. And from that hut, close enough to see faces, they had watched. They watched the guards. They timed the changing of the sentries, learned the rhythm of the shifts, marked which towers were manned and how heavily. They studied the construction of the main gate, how it was built, how it was fastened, what it would take to get through it. They mapped the layout of the compound, the arrangement of the barracks, the position of the enemy quarters relative to the prisoners' area. And crucially, they gathered what they could about the prisoners themselves, enough to confirm the terrible intelligence that had shaped the plan from the beginning, that these men were, most of them, in no condition to save themselves, that a rescue force could not simply open the gate and expect the prisoners to run for it, that a rescue force would have to carry them out on their backs and would need something more than backs to carry the ones too broken even for that. The answer to that problem had come not from any American, but from a Filipino. From Captain Juan Pajota, whose guerrillas lay in the ditch alongside the Rangers this very night, and who knew this country as the Americans never could because it was his. It was Pajota who understood that the thing this operation truly needed was not more guns but more capacity, the physical means to move dozens of men who could not move themselves across miles of ground quickly before the enemy could organize a response. And it was Pajota who arranged the answer that no American planner would have thought of: carabao, water buffalo, the great patient plodding beasts that pulled the ploughs and the carts of every farm on the plain, gathered from the surrounding barrios, hitched to their wooden carts and staged along the route toward the Pampanga River, ready to receive the men who could not walk and haul them to safety. It was an answer drawn entirely from the ordinary machinery of Filipino rural life, bent to an extraordinary purpose, and it would prove to be one of the pieces on which the whole rescue turned. So the equation the Rangers carried into the ditch was this: roughly 511 men to be freed, an unknown but large number of them unable to walk, 30 miles of enemy country to cross, a single hour at most before the alarm went up and the whole Japanese garrison of central Luzon began converging on the camp, and an oath, sworn on their knees at Guimba, that not one of those 511 men would be left behind. Not a single one. The orders that would govern the assault reflected that arithmetic down to the smallest detail. As the men lay in the ditch through the last hour, the instructions moved among them the only way instructions could move in a place where no one dared raise his voice. Man to man, mouth to ear, a whisper passed down the line and repeated back to confirm it had been heard right. Which teams would take the towers? Which would blow the main gate and which would go through the rear? Who would provide covering fire and who would go straight for the barracks? And threaded through all of it, the human logistics of the thing, the understanding passed from ranger to ranger that once inside the wire their job was not only to shoot but to gather, to get to the prisoners, to reassure them, to lift the ones who could not lift themselves, to sort in seconds the men who could stumble toward the gate from the men who would have to be picked up bodily and carried. There would be no time to be gentle, there would be barely time to be quick, and every man in the ditch had sworn that he would do it or die. Mucci's order sat over all of it, absolute and unqualified, the distilled essence of everything he had demanded in the schoolhouse courtyard 2 days before. All prisoners go, no one gets left behind. There was no clause in it for difficulty. There was no exception for the men who could not walk, because the whole point, the entire moral architecture of the operation, was built on the refusal to make such an exception. The men who could not walk were the reason the carabao carts were waiting. They were the reason the scouts had crawled to within 300 yards of the wire to learn exactly what was needed. They were, in a sense, the reason for the mission itself, because a rescue that saved only the strong would not have been a rescue at all. It would have been a selection, and the men of the 6th Ranger Battalion had come 30 miles behind the lines, precisely so that no one would be selected against. Why now? Why this camp? This night? This desperate reach so far behind enemy lines? Because of what had happened somewhere else, on another island, weeks before. On the island of Palawan, American prisoners had been herded into air raid shelters by their Japanese guards and burned alive, a mass killing that revealed to the American command that a policy existed for the disposal of prisoners rather than their surrender when liberation drew near. The lesson was unmistakable, and it was terrifying. As American forces closed in on the Philippines, the men in the camps were not safer. They were in greater danger than ever, because a retreating enemy that had decided its prisoners would not be handed back alive would act on that decision precisely at the moment rescue seemed near. The advancing front, which should have meant hope for the men of Cabanatuan, might instead be a countdown to their execution. That was the calculation that had put the Rangers in this ditch. Not the ordinary momentum of an advancing army, but a race to reach 511 men before someone with a match and an order reach them first. And so they wait. The light is entirely gone now. The insects have swallowed the world in sound. The mud has not warmed and will not warm. Along a mile of shallow ditch on the central plain of Luzon, 121 Americans and the guerrillas of Pahota and Joson lie pressed into the earth, breathing shallow, passing whispers hand to hand, each of them holding in his mind the same picture: the wire, the towers, the gate, and beyond it the barracks full of men they have never met and have sworn to carry home. Somewhere out ahead of them, closer to the wire than any sane man would go, an Alamo scout is counting the guards in the towers one more time. And overhead, in the black tropical sky, something is about to appear that will make every Japanese sentry in that camp forget, for a few precious minutes, to look at the ground. Before there could be a signal, before there could be a ditch worth lying in, before there could be a plan at all, there had to be knowledge. And knowledge, on the central plain of Luzon in the last week of January 1945, was not a thing that came free. It had to be crawled toward. It had to be earned yard by yard across open ground where a single raised head, a single glint of movement in the Kogan grass, could unravel everything. The men who paid that price were not the Rangers waiting now in the mud. They were a smaller, stranger tribe, the Alamo Scouts of the US 6th Army, and they had gone in first, days before, into country the Americans called by an old and honest name. They called it Indian country. It meant the land beyond the last friendly line, where every farmer might be an informer, every dog a betrayer, every open field a killing ground, and where a man who was caught could expect nothing at all. The Scouts had been built for exactly this. They were a reconnaissance unit in the purest sense, not raiders, not shock troops, but observers whose entire art lay in going where no one thought a man could go, seeing what needed to be seen, and coming back alive to say it. They worked in small teams, 6 men to a team, and for Cabanatuan 2 teams had been committed under 2 lieutenants, whose names would become inseparable from the raid's success. William Nellis led one, Tom Rounceville led the other. Between them they carried the discipline of men who had learned that survival behind the lines was not a matter of courage in the theatrical sense, but of patience so total it approached stillness, the ability to lie in one position for hours, to move only when nothing moved, to count and record and remember, and above all to resist the enormous human temptation to act. A scout who acted was a scout who died. The whole value of the unit lay in its restraint. The problem the terrain set them was severe. Camp Pangatian sat on flat exposed ground, the classic Luzon paddy country where a man on his belly could be seen from a great distance by anyone with reason to look. There was no ridgeline to observe from, no tree line close enough to matter, no fold in the earth that would hide a watcher within useful range of the wire. To learn what Prince needed to know, the number of towers, the number of men in each, the placement of the machine guns, the rhythm of the shift changes, someone had to get close, not comfortably close, impossibly close. And the answer Nellis arrived at was the kind of thing that reads, in hindsight, as either genius or madness, and was in fact both. He would hide in plain sight. Nellist and Private First Class Rufo Vaquilar shed their uniforms and pulled on the clothing of Filipino peasants, the loose shirts, the worn trousers, the wide straw hats that turned a soldier into a figure of no interest at all, one more farmer among the thousands who worked these fields. Vaquila's own heritage made the disguise plausible in a way it could never have been for most of the Americans. A glance would not betray him. And so the two of them walked, unhurried, into the open and occupied an abandoned shack, a nipa hut of woven palm that stood within 300 yards of the camp's perimeter. 300 yards. From inside that flimsy structure, through the gaps in its walls, they had a clear and sustained view of the stockade that no man crawling through grass could ever have matched. They could watch for hours. They could watch through the heat of the day and into the failing light. They could count, and they counted everything. From that hut and from the crawling reconnaissance that supplemented it, the scouts assembled a portrait of Camp Pangatian precise enough to build an operation around. The stockade measured roughly 600 yards by 800, enclosed not by a single fence, but by 3 concentric barbed wire barriers, a detail that mattered enormously because 3 fences meant 3 obstacles between a ranger and the men he had come to save, 3 lines that would have to be cut or crossed under fire in the seconds when speed was everything. There was a main gate, and at that gate a single sentry stood watch. There were 3 guard towers, each rising some 12 feet above the flat ground, each a nest from which a machine gun or a rifle could sweep the approaches. There was a pillbox, a low hardened firing position, and inside it the scouts determined 4 armed men. To the south of the compound they found something that turned every calculation grim. A tank park, armoured vehicles parked and available, capable of ending the raid in minutes if their crews reached them in time. And east of the main road, they identified the shape of a large cavalry bivouac. More soldiers, more rifles, more reasons that this could go wrong. But the single most valuable thing the scouts carried out was not a count of men or a map of fences. It was a rhythm. The tower guards, they observed, rotated on intervals of approximately 1 hour. That number, 1 hour, was worth more than a company of reinforcements because it told Prince not merely what the defences were, but when they were softest. A shift change is a moment of distraction, of men climbing down and men climbing up, of eyes that are on the ladder rather than on the field. It is a seam in the fabric of vigilance. Knowing when those seams opened let a planner choose his moment rather than gamble on it. And that, more than anything, was the gift the scouts brought back from Indian country. Not just the enemy's strength, but the enemy's timing. There is a phrase that attached itself to Cabanatuan afterward, and it belongs precisely to this, to the difference between what the raid would have been without the scouts and what it became with them. Without them, the raid was a massacre. 120 men rushing blind across open ground toward an unknown number of defenders in fixed positions, cutting through fences they did not know were there, walking into machine gun arcs they could not have anticipated, with tanks to the south and cavalry to the east that they had no idea existed. That is not an operation. That is a slaughter waiting for a place to happen. But with the scouts' intelligence, the whole thing changed character. It stopped being a leap into darkness and became something colder and more survivable. A problem in geometry, angles and distances, fields of fire and blind spots, the exact placement of each threat, and therefore the exact way to neutralize each threat before it could speak. Geometry can be solved. Darkness cannot. The scouts had converted the one into the other, and every man in the ditch tonight owed his chances to that conversion, whether he knew the names Nellist and Ronceville or not. The scouts gave one more thing, and it may have been the most important of all. Not a fact, but a judgment. When they had gathered enough, when they had watched the camp long enough to understand not only its layout but its mood, they made a recommendation that took nerve of a different kind than crawling toward wire. They recommended that the raid be delayed. Not because the plan was wrong, but because the enemy activity in the area was too heavy on the intended night. Too many Japanese moving too near the objective for the operation to have a reasonable chance. It is one thing to risk your own life going forward. It is another to look at a colonel who has marched 120 men 30 miles for this purpose and tell him to wait. But the scouts told him to wait, and their judgment would prove vital, the delay of a single day reshaping the arithmetic of the whole night in ways that could not have been foreseen. Nellist, years later, reduced the entire achievement to a sentence that carried no boast in it whatsoever. We did what we were trained to do, that was all. In that flatness lay the whole ethic of the unit, the understanding that the extraordinary, when it is a matter of training and discipline rather than luck, does not require inflation. It requires only that it be done. Everything the Rangers would do this night rested on the foundation those men had laid, and now the man who had taken that foundation and built a plan upon it lay somewhere along the same ditch, running through it one final time in his mind. He was 24 years old, Captain Robert Prince, commanding C Company of the 6th Ranger Battalion, and it had fallen to him, not to Mucci, who commanded the whole, but to Prince, who commanded the assault, to convert the scouts' intelligence into a sequence of actions precise enough that men crawling in the dark could execute it without hesitation. He had done it, in the end, the way such things have always been done, with the humblest tools available. In the Barrio schoolhouse at Platero, and in the dirt itself, he had drawn the camp. A stick scratching lines into the earth. Here the fences, here the gate, here the towers, the pillbox, the barracks where the guards slept and stored their weapons. And then, over that scratched geometry, he had laid the choreography of the attack. The plan was, at its heart, an exercise in simultaneity. 2 assault elements would breach the main compound at the same moment, not one after another, but together, so that the defenders would face fire from more than one direction in the same instant, and have no clean line to concentrate against. A 3rd element carried the most delicate assignment of all, to neutralize the Japanese barracks building before its occupants could reach their weapons. This was the pivot on which everything turned. Soldiers asleep or resting in a barracks are not soldiers yet. They are men who must wake, orient, find their rifles, and organize before they become a fighting force, and that process takes seconds, precious seconds during which they are lethally vulnerable if someone is already firing into them. If the 3rd element did its work, the barracks would never become a barracks full of soldiers. It would remain a building full of men who never got to their guns. If the 3rd element failed, or hesitated, or arrived even moments late, then dozens of armed and enraged defenders would pour into a fight already crowded with helpless prisoners, and the geometry Prince had laboured over would dissolve into exactly the massacre the scouts had made it possible to avoid. And around all of it, holding the whole fragile construction together, was the matter of the road to the northeast, the road that led to Kabu and to the 800 to 1,000 Japanese soldiers who could come down it. That threat had a name and a solution, and both belonged to Pahota. His guerrillas would block the Kabu River bridge and hold it, keeping the reinforcements on the far side of the water long enough for the Rangers to do their work and get the prisoners away. But that block was itself dependent on timing, on positioning, on everything happening in the order and at the moment Prince had set, which is why, of all the elements of the plan, the one that mattered most was not a weapon or a maneuver or a man, it was a signal Prince would give it. A single shot, or a flare. One clean, unmistakable stimulus that would tell every element all at once that the waiting was over and the attack had begun. Until that signal, nothing moved. After it, everything moved together, and the terrible fragility of the whole design lay in that gap between nothing and everything, because the signal only worked if no one anticipated it. If a single ranger, anywhere along that mile of ditch, lost his nerve and fired early, or was seen and drew fire, or simply moved when he should have stayed still and gave the game away, then the assault would begin not on Prince's terms but on the enemy's. The towers would be manned and alert instead of caught mid-rotation. The barracks would wake before the 3rd element reached it. The machine guns at the gate would find their arcs. And the prisoners, the whole reason for all of it, would be caught in the crossfire of a fight that had started too soon and in the wrong place. One man moving early would not endanger himself alone. He would kill everyone, rangers, guerrillas, and 511 starving men who had survived 3 years of hell only to die in the last hour before their rescue. That was the weight pressing down on the 24-year-old captain as he lay in the ditch. It was a weight that Prince himself, reflecting long afterward, would name without flinching. Any commander's greatest fear, he said, is the fear of failure. It preys on you. It preyed on him now, in the dark, with the plan complete and nothing left to do but wait for the moment to spring it. There is a particular agony to that interval, the space between a plan on paper and the test of that plan against the world. On paper, the elements move in perfect concert. On paper, the barracks fall silent before the guards can rise. On paper, the towers are caught mid-shift and the fences part like curtains. But paper does not bleed, and paper does not panic, and paper does not have a man in it whose foot slips at the wrong moment. The 60 minutes in the ditch were the duration of that interval, the last stretch of time in which the raid was still a beautiful idea, before it became a real thing happening to real men, with all the friction and chance that reality drags behind it. Prince had done everything a planner could do. Now the plan belonged to the knight. But there was one more voice in the design of this operation, one more mind whose contribution was so fundamental that without it, the elegant geometry Prince had drawn would have been a suicide note. That mind belonged to a Filipino. Captain Juan Pajota commanded Squadron 211 of the USAFI PNL guerrillas, and when he first sat down with Mucci and Prince to hear their plan, he listened, and then he told them something that changed everything. The Americans had intended to strike quickly, to hit the camp on the earliest possible night and get out. Pajota, who knew this ground the way a man knows his own hands, told them plainly that an immediate attack would be suicide. Not difficult, not risky, suicide. And he gave them the reason with the specificity that could not be argued away. Barely half a mile northeast of the POW compound, across the Kabu River, a reinforced Japanese force was bivouacked. A body of soldiers he estimated at some 800 men, part of a formation the records would name the Doko Homen Butai. That was not a garrison to be surprised. That was an army waiting on the far side of a bridge, and once the shooting started at the camp, once the sound of it carried across the flat night air to Kabu, those men would come. How fast! Pajota did the arithmetic that the Americans, for all their planning, had not been able to do because they did not know the ground. The Japanese at Kabu could reach the compound in under 4 minutes once firing commenced. 4 minutes. Consider what that meant against the shape of the raid. The Rangers needed far more than 4 minutes to breach 3 fences, clear the compound, subdue the guards, and, hardest of all, gather 511 prisoners, most of them weak, many unable to walk, and move them out through the gate and away. 4 minutes did not buy a fraction of the time the rescue required. In 4 minutes, the assault would still be in its opening spasm when 800 fresh Japanese soldiers arrived on its flank. The Rangers would be caught between the guards inside the wire and the reinforcements outside it, and the prisoners would be caught in the middle of all of it. Pajota was not offering an opinion. He was reading a countdown that the Americans could not see, and telling them that their plan, as it stood, ended in annihilation. So he made a demand, and it was a demand from a guerrilla captain to an American colonel, which took its own kind of authority. Delay the raid. 24 hours. Give his guerrillas the time to move into position along the Kabu River, to fortify the approaches to the bridge, to establish a genuine blocking force that could meet the reinforcements at the water and hold them there. If the Rangers went in before that block was in place, the 4-minute clock would kill them all. If they waited one day, Pajota's men would be dug in astride the road, and the 800 at Kabu would find the bridge held against them at the exact moment they most needed to cross it. The delay was not caution. It was the difference between a raid that could survive and a raid that could not. Mucci listened, and Mucci agreed. It was not an easy thing to agree to. Every hour of delay was another hour in which someone at the camp might decide to do to these prisoners what had been done to the men at Palawan. Every hour was another roll of the dice with 500 lives. But Pajota's logic was unanswerable, and the man delivering it had earned the right to be believed. This was his country. These were his people's fields and rivers. He had lived among this enemy for 3 years and knew what it would do and how fast it could do it. To override him would have been to substitute American impatience for Filipino knowledge, and Mucci, whatever else he was not a fool. The raid moved to the 30th. Pajota's men began to move toward the bridge. Pajota's hand was in more than the timing. It was in the texture of the operation, the small human problems that could betray a stealthy approach as surely as any tank. He coordinated with the villagers along the route to keep their dogs from barking as the rangers passed, a detail so ordinary it is almost comic, and so vital that its neglect could have ended everything before it began. A single dog raising the alarm in the wrong barrio could have sent word ahead. Pajota saw to it that the dogs stayed silent. And it was Pajota, drawing again on the resources of his own people, who understood the problem of the men who could not walk, and proposed the solution that the whole moral architecture of the raid depended upon. The carabao carts, the water buffalo and their wooden carts, gathered from the villages and staged along the withdrawal route to carry out the prisoners too weak to move under their own power. The rangers had sworn that no one would be left behind. Pajota gave them the means to keep that oath. The man who accomplished all this was, by the account of those who knew him, the opposite of a warlord out of legend. Robert Lapham, an American who led guerrillas of his own in the Philippines and knew the men who fought that war, described Pajota as a very unflamboyant guy with a natural bent for leadership. No theatrics, no swagger, just competence and the quiet gravity that made men follow him. He had, Lapham said, the political wherewithal to mobilize the local support the raid absolutely required, the standing among his own people to summon carts and silence dogs and station fighters, to turn a network of villages into the invisible scaffolding around an American operation. Without that scaffolding, the Rangers would have been 120 strangers stumbling through hostile dark. With it, they were a spearhead riding on the shoulders of an entire countryside that had chosen, at enormous risk to itself, to help. And so the blocking force that would decide whether any of them lived was not the Rangers at all. It was Pajota's guerrillas, and they were at this very hour taking up their positions along the Cabu River to the northeast, sighting their weapons on a bridge, preparing to stand between 800 Japanese soldiers and 511 men who could not run. The survivability of the whole enterprise had been designed by a Filipino captain and would be purchased by Filipino blood. That truth sat at the centre of Cabanatuan, and would too often be left at its edges in the telling. The geometry was Prince's. The eyes had been the scouts. The oath was Mucci's. But the reason any of it could work, the reason the 4-minute clock would not simply run out and kill them all, was that Juan Pajota had looked at an American plan, seen the death in it, and quietly rebuilt it into something a man could survive. Now every piece was in place, or moving toward its place, in the darkness across the plain. The scouts had counted the towers, and would count them once more before the end. Prince held his signal and his fear in equal measure. Pajota's men crouched at the bridge, the carabao carts waited, and the prisoners, who knew nothing of any of it, lay in their cages under the same stars, another ordinary night of hunger between them and either liberation or the fire. All of it now waited on timing, on the seam in the enemy's attention that Prince needed and did not yet have. He needed the towers looking somewhere other than the field. He needed the sentries for a few minutes to forget the ground. And in the black sky above Camp Pangatian, the thing that would make them forget was already droning in from the north, low and strange, an aircraft flying a pattern no ordinary night patrol would ever fly. To understand why that aircraft was in the sky at all, why 121 rangers and near 300 guerrillas had walked 30 miles into a place from which there might be no walking back, you have to go back 6 weeks and 500 miles south, to an island called Palawan, and to a date that men in intelligence bunkers on Luzon would not have been able to forget if they tried. December 14th, 1944. At Puerto Princesa, on the western coast of Palawan, the Japanese held roughly 150 American prisoners of war. These were men much like the men in the cages at Cabanatuan, captured in the collapse of the Philippines, survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, 3 years into a captivity that had ground them down to shadows. They had been put to work building an airstrip, and on that December morning, with American aircraft ranging ever closer and the front line crawling northward through the archipelago, the guards at Puerto Princesa acted on a logic that would haunt every officer who later read the reports. An air raid warning was sounded. The prisoners were herded as they had been many times before into the covered trenches that served as their shelters, trenches roofed over with logs and earth, narrow slots dug into the coral. And then the guards did not wait for any bombers. They doused the entrances with gasoline. They threw in torches. Men who tried to claw their way out of the burning trenches were shot or bayoneted or beaten back into the fire. The massacre was not a battle. It was an execution carried out on the bodies of the helpless, deliberate and organized, and it consumed the great majority of the men in that camp. Of roughly 150 prisoners, only 11 escaped. Men who broke from the trenches, ran for the cliffs, swam or crawled or hid in the undergrowth, and made it somehow to friendly hands. 11 out of 150. Those 11 talked, and what they described travelled up the chain, through guerrilla networks, through survivor testimony, into the intelligence apparatus of the Sixth Army. By January of 1945, the details had been confirmed and understood, and their meaning was unmistakable. The Palawan massacre was not an aberration of one deranged garrison. It was the visible edge of a standing policy, an order that had passed through the Japanese prison system. As the Americans advanced, the prisoners were not to be allowed to be liberated. They were to be killed. The word used in the surviving documentation of that policy was blunt, a directive to annihilate the prisoners, to leave no trace when the situation demanded it. Puerto Princesa was that policy made real, in gasoline and fire, on 139 men. Now hold that fact in one hand and in the other, hold a map of Luzon. Cabanatuan, Camp Pangatian, held 511 Allied prisoners, the largest concentration of Allied POWs still in Japanese hands on the island. And the American front was moving. MacArthur's forces had come ashore at Lingayen Gulf on the 9th of January, and the whole calculus of the Japanese defence of Luzon was shifting toward collapse and retreat. Every mile the Americans' advance brought the moment of decision closer for the garrison, holding those 511 men. Liberation, from the point of view of the men in the cages, was not simply a hope. It was also, if the Palawan pattern held, a trigger, the very thing most likely to get them killed. The closer rescue came, the more likely the fire. This was the clock. This was the thing that started ticking before the Rangers ever heard the name Cabanatuan, and it was a Filipino-American guerrilla leader named Robert Lapham who drove the meaning of that clock home to the men who could act on it. Lapham was one of a handful of American officers who had refused to surrender in 1942 and had melted into the countryside to build resistance networks in the hills and barrios of central Luzon. He knew that country as few Americans could. He knew, too, what the Japanese did to prisoners, and he knew what was sitting in the camp at Cabanatuan. And so, as the American columns pushed inland from Lingayen, Lapham made the journey himself, 30 miles through enemy-held territory, to find the Sixth Army's intelligence officer, Colonel Horton White, and put the danger in front of him in words a staff officer could not evade. He did not couch it in equivocation. If they waited for the conventional forces to arrive in the normal course of the advance, Lapham told them, they would be too late. The line he's remembered for cut to the bone of the matter, that by the time relief came the ordinary way, they would be able to rescue what was left in one carabao cart. One cart. For 511 men. It was a sentence engineered to make an officer see the trenches at Puerto Princesa transposed onto the fences at Cabanatuan, to make him see that the mathematics of a normal advance and the mathematics of a kill-all order did not run in parallel but converged, and that at their convergence there would be nothing left to save. It worked. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, commanding the Sixth Army, authorized the raid, a deep penetration strike 25 miles behind the Japanese lines, into territory the American front had not yet reached and might not reach for days, to pull 511 men out of a cage before the guards could carry out on them what other guards had carried out on Palawan. It was a decision that violated every instinct of conventional caution. You did not, as a rule, send 121 men 25 miles into an enemy's rear on a straight-line march and expect to bring them home. But the alternative was to do nothing, and to know afterward what the doing nothing had cost. Kruger gave the mission to Mucci and the 6th Ranger Battalion, and the reconnaissance that would make it survivable he entrusted to the Alamo Scouts, to the teams that went in first, to Lieutenant Bill Nellist and the men who crawled the open ground around the camp and lay in the weeds close enough to the wire to read the enemy's habits. It was Nellist who worked his way in toward the guard tower, close enough, within 30 yards by the accounts that came after, to watch the sentries and clock their rotations, to learn the seams in their attention that Prince would later have to exploit. And it was into that seam that the strange low-flying aircraft was now being flown. On the night of the 30th, a P-61 Black Widow ordered up to buzz the camp and pull the guards' eyes to the sky. Every piece of the machine that was about to be sprung, the timing, the diversion, the specific brutal instruction that the men who could not walk would be carried out on the backs of Rangers, even at the cost of a weapon. Every piece of it existed because of a fire on Palawan on the 14th of December, and because a guerrilla named Lapham had walked 30 miles to make sure the men who could stop the next fire understood exactly how little time was left. That was the reasoning that put the mission on the map. The march that put the men on the ground began at Guimba, 2 days before the ditch. Guimba was the forward edge of what the Americans held, a town on the plain where the 6th Ranger Battalion staged for the walk-in. From Guimba to Cabanatuan was 30 miles as the column would travel it, and every one of those miles ran deeper into country the Japanese still controlled. The Rangers set out on the 28th of January, 121 men of the 6th, moving to link up with the guerrillas of Pajota and Eduardo Yoson, somewhere between 200 and 280 Filipino fighters who would carry the operation on their shoulders. But before a boot left Guimba, Mucci did a thing that his men would remember for the rest of their lives. He gathered them in a church, and in that church he did not deliver the kind of speech a Hollywood colonel delivers. He asked for an oath. He demanded that every man swear he would die fighting rather than let any harm come to the prisoners of war under his care. He would not take a man who would not swear it. He wanted no one on the march whose commitment ran shallower than that. No one who, at the moment when a ranger might have to choose between his own life and a stranger's, would choose wrong. It was an extraordinary thing to ask of soldiers, and it tells you exactly what Mucci understood the raid to be. This was not a mission where you took the objective and counted the cost afterward. The prisoners were the objective. The men in the cages were the whole point, and a ranger who reached them and then flinched had failed at the only thing that mattered. So Mucci made them all swear it, in a church, before God, and then he walked them out into the dark. They understood him, and they followed him, and the reason they followed him is worth pausing on, because it explains how 120 men could be talked into a march like this one. Mucci was 32 years old, a West Pointer, a small hard man with a pipe clamped in his teeth and a pearl-handled pistol on his hip, and he possessed a quality that the men who served under him struggled to put into words. Private First Class Alvy Robbins tried. Mucci was so charismatic, he said, you couldn't believe it. If you ever had to go to war, that was the kind of man you wanted to go with. Captain Prince, who was no romantic. Prince was the engineer, the man who drew the geometry and knew exactly how thin the margins were. Put it with a dry honesty that only sharpens the point. We knew he was selling us the blue sky, Prince said, but we would have followed him anywhere. That is the whole of it. They knew the sky he was selling might not be there when they arrived. They went anyway, because of what he was, and because of what he had made them swear. The march itself was an exercise in disciplined dread. They moved by night, in single file, a thin, dark thread of men strung out through the barrios of the central Luzon plain, through Balinkaran, through Platero, place names on a map that became, for the rangers who walked through them, the milestones of a journey deeper into a country that could kill them at any doorway. The going was miserable in the mundane, grinding way that all infantry marches are miserable. There were blisters. There were rice paddies to be crossed, and kogon grass, the tall, sharp-edged tropical grass that grows in walls a man has to push through. And the whole of it done in silence, without lights, guided by Pejota's guerrillas who knew every trail and every ford and every house where the family could be trusted. And here is the thing about that march that catches in the throat. The Rangers did not go hungry, and they did not lose their way, because the Filipino civilians of those barrios fed them and guided them at a cost that would have been unthinkable to demand and was freely paid. Food came out through doorways in the dark, passed hand to hand, a bowl, a wrapped parcel, whatever a poor farming family could spare from a countryside that the war had already stripped. And every family that passed a bowl of rice to an American ranger did so, knowing what the Japanese did to Filipinos caught helping the Americans. There was no ambiguity about the penalty. The penalty was death, often preceded by things worse than death, and often extended to the whole household. These people knew that, and they opened their doors anyway, and they fed the men walking through their village toward the camp, because the men were walking toward the camp, because everyone on that plain knew what was in the camp, and whose sons and husbands and countrymen were dying in it, and what it would mean to get them out. Which brings us to the gamble at the centre of the whole infiltration, the decision that reveals more than any tactical detail what kind of thing Mucci was actually attempting. A column of 121 Americans and hundreds of Filipinos cannot move 30 miles through inhabited country without being seen. It is not possible. By the time the Rangers neared Cabanatuan, hundreds of Filipino villagers had laid eyes on the column, had watched it pass in the dark, had known exactly what it was and roughly where it was going. In conventional terms, this was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Any one of those hundreds of witnesses, out of fear or greed or coercion or simple carelessness, could have sent word ahead to the Japanese, and word sent ahead would have meant the column marching into a prepared ambush, or the garrison at the camp doing to the prisoners exactly what the garrison at Palawan had done. A single informer could have killed all of them, the Rangers, the guerrillas, and the 511. Mucci knew this. He made the decision to proceed anyway. He weighed the near certainty that the column had been seen against the loyalty of the people who had seen it, and he bet everything, the mission, his men, the prisoners, on that loyalty holding. It was a wager no manual would sanction, a wager staked on a judgment about the human heart of an entire countryside, and it held. Not one of those hundreds betrayed the column. The silence of the barrios was the silence of a people who had made their choice, and the whole raid rode on that silence exactly as surely as it rode on Prince's geometry. It is one of the most remarkable facts of the entire operation, and it is easy to walk past. The security of the mission was guaranteed not by concealment, but by the fidelity of civilians who had every reason of self-preservation to talk, and did not. By the second day, the deeper truth of the march had settled over the column like the heat. They were far enough in now that turning around meant walking the same 30 exposed miles back out, and the proximity of Japanese patrols, the open geometry of the plain, the sheer distance from any friendly line, all of it meant that retreat had become as dangerous as advance. The country around the camp was flat. Prince and Mucci both described it in terms a man does not forget. A billiard table, ground with no cover to speak of, where a moving column could be seen from a great distance, and a moving column that was seen had very few good options. You did not stroll away from a place like that. You could go forward and do the thing you came to do, or you could go backward and be just as exposed with nothing to show for it. The march had passed the point where prudence still had a vote. There was only the objective now, and the ditch, and the wire beyond it. And so they came to the ditch, the drainage ditch a mile from the fence where the whole force went to ground in the last light of the 29th, and lay through the long day of the 30th, waiting for the dark that would let them cross the open ground. It is to that ditch we return now in the final hour, in the narrow window between 7 and 7:30 in the evening, when the whispering began. The atmosphere in the ditch was made of two things: absolute silence, and the low passage of orders murmured from mouth to ear down the length of a line of prone men. There was no talking above a breath. 120 men lay in the dirt in the dark, and the discipline of their stillness was itself a kind of weapon, because the ground between them and the camp was that same open plain, and a careless sound could carry. Into that silence Mucci moved personally along the line. This is the image that recurs in the memoirs of the men who were there. The colonel going man to man, section leader to section leader, confirming with his own eyes and his own low voice that each of them understood exactly what he was to do when the signal came. He had made them swear an oath in a church. Now, in the ditch, he was making sure the oath had a shape, that every man knew which piece of the plan was his. The orders that travelled down the line were precise, and their precision was the whole architecture of the raid rendered into instructions a single soldier could hold in his head. Specific rangers were assigned to specific barracks buildings inside the wire, this squad to this structure, that squad to the next, so that when the assault broke, the clearing of the camp would happen everywhere at once and nowhere by accident. Every man knew his building. Every man knew his lane. Prince had drawn the geometry. Now the geometry was being distributed, whispered, one squad at a time, until the plan lived not on paper, but in the bodies of the men who would execute it. Two instructions above all others were pressed into every ear, and between them they held the entire moral and tactical logic of the night. The first was a prohibition, and it was absolute. No ranger was to fire a single shot until Captain Prince gave the signal. Not if he saw a sentry, not if his nerve broke, not for any reason. The entire assault depended on surprise, on the sentries and the tower guards being oblivious until the instant of the opening volley, and a single premature shot would throw that surprise away and turn a raid into a firefight against an alerted garrison, with 511 hostages at its mercy. So the men lay in the ditch with their weapons ready and their fingers off the triggers, and the discipline that held them was the same discipline that had held the barrios silent. 100 men each individually capable of destroying everything, each individually choosing not to. The second instruction was the one that reached back to the church at Guimba and to the fire on Palawan, and made physical the oath every man had sworn. All the prisoners were coming out, every one, and the men who could not walk, the ones wrecked by malaria and dysentery and beriberi, the ones who might not be able to stand, let alone run across a mile of open ground under fire, those men were to be carried on the backs of the rangers, and the order was explicit about the price. If carrying a man meant a ranger had to drop his weapon, he dropped his weapon. The prisoner came first. A soldier's rifle is the thing he clings to above almost anything, the instrument of his own survival, and here was an order telling him that a stranger's body took precedence over his own means of defending it. That instruction, whispered down the line in the dark, was the oath in Guimba translated into a specific weight on a specific spine. It was Mucci's promise to God made operational. "No one left behind" was not a slogan in the ditch. It was a logistics problem with a human answer. And the answer was that a ranger's back was the vehicle, and a ranger's rifle was the acceptable cost. You can feel, lying in that ditch with those men, how completely the scale of things had collapsed. 6 weeks earlier, the story had been the size of an ocean. A policy in Tokyo, a massacre on Palawan, a general's decision, an army's advance. A guerrilla walking 30 miles to make a colonel understand. Now all of that had funneled down to this. A man in the dirt hearing in a whisper the number of the building he was to clear, and the instruction that if a prisoner could not walk he was to be carried, and the rifle, if it came to it, could be left in the mud. The clock that had started ticking over the trenches at Puerto Princesa was down to its last minutes, and it was ticking now in the pulse of 120 men lying still on a billiard table of open ground, a mile from 511 others who did not yet know that rescue was this close, or that rescue was the very thing that might get them killed if the timing failed. Mucci reached the end of the line. Every section leader had answered him. Every man knew his building, knew the prohibition, knew the weight he might have to carry. There was nothing left to arrange. There was only the seam in the enemy's attention that Prince still needed. The towers turned away, the sentry's eyes pulled off the field, and overhead, droning in low and strange out of the northern dark, flying its impossible pattern, the thing that would open that seam was arriving over Camp Pangatian at last. 300 yards from the main gate, inside an abandoned shack whose nipa roof had begun to sag under 3 years of neglect, 2 men in wide-brimmed straw hats lay flat against the earthen floor and did the one thing that no plan, however elegant, could do for itself. They watched. Lieutenant Bill Nellist and Private Rufo Vaquilar had spent the daylight hours as farmers, bent, slow, unremarkable figures who belonged so completely to that landscape that no sentry gave them a second look, and now, with the light going out of the sky over the central Luzon plain, they were making their final count. Not the count from a briefing map, not the count from memory, the count as it stood right now, in the last hour, with the shadows lengthening across the compound, and the shapes of men moving between buildings hardening and softening as the daylight failed. This was the last chance to be wrong before it mattered. Nellist worked the camp the way a man reads a page he has read 100 times, looking not for what he already knows, but for what has changed. The main gate, he could see it plainly, could see which way it swung, could see the sentry posted there and count the seconds of his pacing. The towers, 12 feet of bamboo and timber, each one a platform for a pair of eyes and a machine gun. He could mark them, could time the guards, could see the way a man in a tower leans on the rail when the hours grow long and the plain gives him nothing to look at. The strands of wire, the 3 fences ringing the compound, the pillbox squatting near the gate with its 4-man crew. All of that was in his sketch, and all of that he confirmed with his own eyes in the failing light. Years later he would put it as plainly as a man can put anything. They knew which way the gate opened. They knew how many guards there were, what time they changed, how many strands of wire there were, and the works. The works. It is a small, flat American word for an enormous thing, the sum of everything 2 men could learn about a killing ground by lying in the dirt and looking at it for hours. And it was, by the standard of any reconnaissance in any war, magnificent. Nellist and his team had delivered the skeleton on which Prince had hung the entire assault. Where the breach elements would go, which buildings the guard barracks element would clear, how long the crawl across the open field would take, where the towers could see and where their cones of vision fell into shadow. All of it rested on what the Alamo scouts had brought back from within 30 yards of the wire. And yet, there is a problem at the heart of every raid ever conceived, and it is not a problem of courage or of planning or of will. It is a problem of knowledge, of the difference between what a man can see and what a man cannot, and the terrible fact that the space between the two is exactly where soldiers die. Nellis could see the gate. He could not see inside the prisoner barracks. He could count the towers, but he could not count with certainty the men asleep or resting or cleaning their weapons inside the Japanese enlisted barracks on the north side of the compound, the low buildings where, if the raid went wrong, the first organised resistance would come from. He could track a guard's routine. He could not track a guard's mood, or whether a sergeant would choose that night to double the watch, or whether some officer would decide on a whim to walk the perimeter at the precise moment 120 men were crawling toward it. The numbers themselves were a shifting thing. The estimate held that perhaps 200 Japanese troops occupied the camp, with as many as 1,000 more within striking distance across the plain. But an estimate is not a count. An account taken at noon is not a truth guaranteed at 7 in the evening. The garrison of a place like Camp Cabanatuan was not a fixed quantity. Men came and went, units passed through. A convoy could halt for the night and turn 200 defenders into 400, with no warning at all to the 2 farmers watching from a shack 300 yards away. This was the variable that no amount of watching could fully pin down, and Nellis knew it, and Prince knew it, and Mucci knew it, and it was the knowledge every one of them carried into the dark like a stone in the boot. So the men in the ditch a mile out were acting on the best picture that could be had. Not a perfect one. There is no perfect one. There has never been a perfect one, in any war, on any night, for any raid. The picture was a good picture, a very good picture, one of the best any small unit had ever assembled of an objective it intended to storm, and it was still at its edges a guess. The interior of the barracks was a black box. The exact number of rifles that would answer the first shot was a black box. What the men could not see, they had to assume, and what they assumed, they had built a plan around, and the plan would meet the reality of the thing at precisely the moment the reality could no longer be changed, the moment of the first shot. That is the bargain of reconnaissance. You send your sharpest eyes as close as flesh can go, and they bring back everything the human eye can gather, and it is never everything. The fog of war is not a metaphor for confusion. It is a precise description of the boundary of sight. Nellist and Vauquelin had pushed that boundary as far forward as any 2 men could push it, all the way to within a stone's throw of the wire, and beyond that boundary lay the barracks and the men inside them, and the truth that would not be known until it was too late to unknow it. At 1940, that boundary began to matter less than the seam, because at 1940, something arrived over the camp that pulled every set of Japanese eyes off the field, where the fog was thickest, and turned them upward, toward a sky where the strangest instrument of the entire operation was beginning to perform. It had taken off 2 hours earlier, at 1800 hours, from a field to the south, a black, twin-boomed, twin-engine machine that looked less like an airplane than like something dreamed up to frighten men in the dark. A P-61 Black Widow, a night fighter, the largest fighter the United States put into the air in that war, built to hunt other aircraft in the blackness with radar and a belly full of cannon. It belonged to the 547th Night Fighter Squadron, and it carried a name painted on its nose that would become, in the retelling, almost unbearably apt: Hard to Get. In the cockpit sat Captain Kenneth Schreiber. The spelling wanders across the records. Schreiber, the way names do when history writes them down in a hurry. And behind him, working the radar he would not need tonight, First Lieutenant Bonnie Rux. The Black Widow was designed to kill things it could not see. Tonight it had been given the opposite assignment. Tonight it was to be seen and heard and above all watched, to make itself so compelling a spectacle in the northern sky that the men in the towers and the sentries at the gate would forget, for the crucial minutes, that the ground beneath them was worth watching too. Consider what that required, and consider that it had to be done without a single word passing between the men in the air and the men on the ground. There was no radio link. Schreiber could not call down to the ditch and say, "I am here, I am beginning, are your men in position?" The Rangers could not call up and say, "Hold, we need 3 more minutes." The whole thing ran on a clock and on trust, on the coordination of a timetable set in advance and executed on faith by men who could not see each other and could not speak. Schreiber had to arrive at the right moment. He had to fly the right pattern over the right place. And then, this was the hard part, the part that made the whole ruse a knife with two edges. He had to leave before the assault began, so that his engines were not drowning out the sound of the first shots, so that his presence did not become a second thing for the guards to react to, at the very instant the Rangers wanted their whole attention consumed by the ground. Arrive on time, perform, vanish on time, all of it by the clock, none of it by voice. He arrived roughly 45 minutes before the ground assault, and he began to perform. What Schreiber did over Camp Pangatian that evening was a piece of flying so deliberate and so counterintuitive that it reads, at first, like an accident being narrated in slow motion. He brought the Black Widow down to 1,500 feet, and at that altitude over the camp he cut the power to one of his two engines. A twin-engined aircraft flying on one engine is a wounded thing, and a wounded thing in the night sky over an occupied plane is a magnet for every eye that can find it. Then he restarted the dead engine, and a large radial engine brought back to life does not resume quietly. It coughs, it backfires, it throws loud, ragged reports into the night, the sound of an aircraft in distress, the sound of a machine on the edge of failing. And then he cut the engine again and restarted it again, and the backfires rolled out over the camp a second time and a third, each report a fresh hook into the attention of the men on the ground. He did not stay at 1,500 feet. He brought the aircraft lower, down and down until, in the passes that came closest, the Black Widow was skimming at 200 feet, clearing the low hills near the camp by as little as 30 feet. 30 feet. A night fighter of that size, in the dark, threading over hilltops with a margin thinner than the length of the aircraft itself, throwing false engine failures into the air to sell the illusion of a plane about to fall out of the sky. To the guards in the towers it must have looked exactly like what Schreiber intended it to look like. A crippled American aircraft, staggering, coughing, sinking toward a crash, a drama unfolding directly overhead and demanding to be watched to its conclusion. And they watched. That was the whole point, and it worked. The Japanese guards, who had spent the day looking outward across a flat plain for exactly the kind of approach the Rangers were about to make, turned their faces up to the sky and kept them there, transfixed, waiting to see whether the stricken machine would go down, following it as it wheeled and dropped and backfired and climbed and dropped again. Every second a guard spent staring at Hard to Get was a second he did not spend staring at the field where 120 men were, at that very moment, crawling flat across the open ground on their bellies, closing the last distance to the wire. Because the terrain gave them nothing. This was the reason the diversion was not a flourish, but a necessity. The ground between the ditch and the camp was, as it had been from the first, a billiard table, flat, open, offering almost no cover for men who had to cross it in the last light and the first dark. Without the Black Widow overhead, the crawl across that ground would have been a crawl beneath 100 watching eyes, and the odds of 120 men covering the last stretch unseen would have collapsed towards zero. Schreiber's absurd, magnificent one-engine death-throw performance over the camp was quite literally the cover the terrain refused to provide. Cover made not of earth, but of misdirection, a shadow cast not by darkness, but by spectacle. The Rangers in the ditch heard it before their comrades had finished crawling. They heard the engines, the cough and roar of the restarts, the backfires rolling across the plain, and those who could risk lifting their eyes saw it, the navigation lights of the Black Widow tracking overhead against the darkening sky, red and green, moving slow and low and strange. Those small coloured lights, passing over 120 men flat in a drainage ditch, were the closest thing to air support any of them would have that night. No bombs would fall for them. No strafing run would soften the wire. There was only this, one aircraft, one crew, one performance, a pair of navigation lights sliding across the dark, and it was enough, because it was aimed not at the enemy's body but at the enemy's attention. Prince understood exactly what that machine had done. The P-61, he would say afterward, was one of the biggest factors in maintaining their surprise, and they had done a wonderful job of it. It is a spare tribute, without adjectives to spare, and it holds inside it the entire weight of what was accomplished at 1,500 feet and 200 feet over Camp Pangatian. That a plane built to kill in the dark had, on this one night, kept a garrison of men alive to their own peril right up until the moment the Rangers wanted them alive to nothing at all. While Schreiber wheeled and coughed his engine over the camp, a half-mile to the northeast another kind of work was reaching its own final minutes. Quieter work, work with no navigation lights, work whose entire purpose was to be invisible until the instant it became loud. At the Cabu River, where a bridge carried the road across the water toward the camp, Captain Juan Pajota's guerrillas were taking their positions. Pajota commanded roughly 200 Filipino fighters, and their assignment was the one on which every other part of the night depended, though it would never be the part the story remembered first. The Rangers would breach the wire and clear the buildings and carry the prisoners out. Joson's men would guard the southern approach, and Pajota's men would hold the bridge, would stand between the camp and the Japanese force across the river, the garrison estimated at over 1,000 troops, close enough that if they crossed unopposed they could be inside the compound in minutes. If that force came across the Cabu Bridge before the prisoners were clear of the camp and moving down the road, then everything else that happened that night would not matter. The Rangers would be trapped in the open with 511 men who could barely walk, and the road south would become a killing ground. So Pajota's guerrillas prepared the crossing with the care of men who understood exactly what would happen if they failed. They strung wire across the approaches. They placed landmines, roughly 50 of them, in the ground the Japanese would have to move over to reach the bridge, turning the earth itself into a weapon that would announce the enemy's advance in fire and force him to come slow and come broken. They positioned their riflemen behind the earthen approaches to the bridge, the raised banks giving them cover and giving them fields of fire down onto anyone attempting to cross. Their armament tells you everything about the kind of fight they were preparing to have. They carried primarily M1 carbines, light, quick weapons, good for the volume of fire a small force needs to hold a choke point, but not the weapons of an army meant to stand toe-to-toe with 1,000 men in open battle. They had supplemented the carbines with captured Japanese equipment, the accumulated salvage of years of guerrilla war against the same enemy they were now waiting for. And they had one bazooka. One. A single shoulder-fired rocket launcher against whatever the Cabu garrison might bring across the river, including, as it would turn out, tanks. There is a detail here that captures, better than almost anything, how much of this night was being carried by improvisation and nerve. The man who would fire that bazooka had been trained on it by the Rangers only hours earlier. He had not carried it for months, had not drilled with it, had not learned it in some rear area school. He had been handed the weapon and shown how it worked in the compressed time before the assault, and then he had taken it to the bridge, and when the fighting came he would use it to disable 4 Japanese tanks. 4. With a weapon he had learned to fire that same day. It is the kind of fact that would strain belief in fiction, and it happened at the Cabu Bridge because a Filipino guerrilla with a few hours' instruction understood, as clearly as any West Point graduate in the ditch, exactly what those tanks meant if they got across. Pajota knew the arithmetic of what he was attempting, and he did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. He estimated that he could hold the bridge for a limited window, 15 to 20 minutes, the figure most often cited. Long enough for the Rangers to get the prisoners out of the camp and onto the road heading south. 15 to 20 minutes against a force many times his own size, armed as he was armed, with 1 bazooka and 50 mines and 200 men, and the earthen banks of a river crossing. That was the shield. That was the whole of it. If the shield held for those minutes, the column lived. If it broke early, the column died. This was the same man who, when the raid plan was first laid before him, had told Lieutenant Colonel Mucci exactly what he thought of it. "Sir, with all due respect, that is suicide." He had not said it to refuse. He had said it because he knew the ground and knew the enemy and knew the Cabu garrison in a way no American briefing could convey. And his objection was the thing that had forced the 24-hour delay and reshaped the plan into something that might actually work. He was not a flamboyant man. Robert Lapham, who knew the Luzon guerrilla war from the inside, described him as a very unflamboyant guy, with a natural bent for leadership. No theatrics, no bravado. Just the flat competence of a man who understood what was possible and what was not, and arranged his forces accordingly. And now that same unflamboyant man was lying with his fighters behind the banks of the Cabu River, having strung the wire and set the mines and placed his single bazooka in the hands of a man who had learned to fire it that afternoon, waiting to hold a bridge for 15 minutes against 1,000. His men would maintain that position through everything that was about to come. They would hold when the Cabu garrison came across, would hold through the tanks and the massed charges, would hold in the dark against a force that outnumbered them and outgunned them in everything but resolve. And they would not withdraw until they received the signal to do so at 2200 hours. Not until the prisoners were safely en route, not until the shield was no longer needed because the thing it protected had already gotten away. But all of that lay ahead, in the loud hours. In these last minutes it was only preparation, the wire going taut, the mines seated in the earth, the rifleman settling behind the banks, the man with the new weapon finding his line to the road the enemy would use. So the pieces stood arranged across the plain in the last light. Nellis forward in his shack, having made his final count, holding a picture that was as complete as human eyes could make it, and no more complete than that. The Black Widow overhead, coughing its false death throes at 200 feet, holding the guards' faces to the sky. Pajota's 200 at the Cabu Bridge, wired and mined and ready to spend 15 minutes buying the lives of 511 men. And the Rangers themselves, a mile out no longer, closing now, crawling flat across the open ground under the cover of the aircraft's spectacle, closing the last distance toward the wire, while the whole elaborate machinery of misdirection and preparation held the enemy's attention exactly where it needed to be held. Everything that could be arranged had been arranged. The diversion was flying. The bridge was set. The count was made. What remained could not be arranged in advance, could only be endured in silence, in the final stillness before the first shot, as the men who had crawled to the very edge of the wire lay flat in the dark and waited for the one man whose raised hand would turn all of this preparation into the thing it had always been meant to become. There is a kind of quiet that has weight. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of restraint, hundreds of men holding still by an act of will, and it settled over the ground outside Camp Pangatian between 1930 and 1945 as the light went out of the western sky. Mucci had been moving along the line, low, working from man to man in the way he had done since Guimba. A word here, a hand on a shoulder there, the pearl-handled pistol on his hip catching what little light remained. And then he stopped moving. The men who saw him stop understood what it meant. He settled into the ditch with the rest of them, and the last human motion along that line went still, and there was nothing left to do that could be done with the body. There was only the waiting and the discipline of the waiting. The ditch had water in it. Not much, a few inches, cold with the coming of the dry season night, but enough that it found the gaps in a man's clothing and worked its way through, up the front of a uniform pressed flat against the mud, into the belt line, into the boots. The Rangers lay in it because the ground offered no better cover, and they had been trained to take the cover the ground offered. Company C waited in the drainage ditch across the highway from the main gate, close enough to see the sentry box, close enough to count the seconds it would take to cross. Off to the east, Lieutenant John Murphy's 2nd Platoon of Company F had crawled into a ditch 5 feet deep outside the compound's east fence. The platoon that would open the whole affair, and they lay there now in the water and the mud with the wire only yards away, and the nearest tower rising against the last of the sky. Several of them were trembling. They noticed it in themselves and in the man beside them, a fine involuntary shudder running through the muscles of the arms and legs, and afterward, when they tried to describe it, they were careful to say what it was not. It was not fear, or not only fear. It was the body under a load it could not discharge, the adrenaline flooding the system with everything it needed to run, to fight, to move, and the mind holding all of that in check, refusing to let a single muscle act, so that the energy had nowhere to go and turned itself into this fine, continuous shaking. A man could not stop it by wanting to. He could only lie in it, damp and cold and vibrating like a wire under tension, and wait for the moment when the order finally released him. To keep the mind occupied in that suspended state, each of them returned to the thing Mucci had drilled into them until it lived below conscious thought. Not the reason for the raid, not the prisoners in the cages, not the massacre at Palawan, not the oath in the schoolhouse. Those things had done their work already and needed no rehearsal now. What ran through their minds in the last 10 minutes was smaller and harder and entirely practical. The specific door, the specific corner of the specific barracks, the tower assigned to your rifle and no one else's, the distance across the open ground and the count it would take to cross it, and where you would be when the shooting started and where your fire had to go and where it must never go, because the compound would be full of men you had come to save and a bullet does not know the difference. Mucci had made them rehearse these assignments at Guimba in whispers until the sequence was automatic, until a man could run it with his eyes closed, because he understood that in the first 30 seconds there would be no time to think and no room for error, and the only thing that would carry a ranger through those seconds intact was the pattern already laid down in the body. So they lay in the ditch and ran the pattern. Which door? Which corner? Which tower? Again. Again. Above them the Black Widow was still working. Captain Schreiber and his radar man had been over the camp for the better part of an hour, dropping toward the earth and pulling up, cutting an engine and letting it catch again, staging a mechanical death over and over at 200 feet so that the guards below would keep their faces turned upward. It held. The Japanese in the towers watched the strange aircraft stumble across their sky, and while they watched it, they did not watch the ditches. But the margin was thin, and it nearly failed at the last. As Murphy's men made the final small adjustments of their bodies against the east fence, a sentry in the nearest tower turned his head and looked down toward their ditch. He had caught something, a movement, a shape that did not belong to the ground. For a moment the whole operation hung on what he would do next, and then he dismissed it. Whatever he had half seen was not worth the trouble of the aircraft overhead and the routine of a quiet evening, and he looked away, and the men in the ditch breathed again, slowly through the mouth, silent. That was the state of things as the luminous hands of Captain Robert Prince's watch crept toward the mark. 200 men arranged across a darkening plain in absolute stillness, cold water in their clothing, muscles shaking with the load they were not permitted to release, minds running the pattern of doors and corners and towers, and above them a night fighter feigning its own destruction to hold a garrison's eyes on the sky. The silence had become almost a physical thing, a held breath stretched across a mile of ground, and the standing order that hung over all of it had not changed since Guimba, had not softened, would not be revised in the loud hours to come. All prisoners go. No one gets left behind. The men too weak to walk would be carried, even if a ranger had to set down his rifle to do it. That was the promise the whole machine had been built to keep. Now it waited on one man's hand. Prince watched the dial. In the ditch across the highway from the main gate, with the sentry box in front of him and Company C ranged along the line beside him, he watched the small glowing hands close the last of the distance, and at exactly 19:45 hours he rose out of the water and the mud and gave the signal. Accounts of what that signal was do not entirely agree. Some who were there remembered a flare arcing up over the compound. The weight of the record indicates that Prince fired a weapon, a single shot cracking across the silence that had held for 10 minutes. It does not finally matter which. What matters is what that sound did. It was the release the shaking bodies had been waiting for. In the space of a heartbeat, the stillness that had lain over the plain shattered, and 200 men who'd been holding themselves motionless in cold ditches came up off the ground and began to move. They moved everywhere at once. That was the design, and for a few astonishing seconds the design and the reality were the same thing. Along the east fence, Murphy's platoon opened fire on the towers and the pillbox, the assignments they had rehearsed in the dark now executing themselves, each rifle finding the target it had been given. Across the highway, Company C's Rangers rose from the drainage ditch and ran at the main gate, closing the open ground they'd counted 100 times in their minds, and the gate that had stood between the raiders and the prisoners for 3 years came apart under them. Elements struck the Japanese barracks directly, and before the men inside could understand what was happening, before they could reach their weapons, before they could form any answer to it, grenades were coming through the openings, and the barracks that should have poured out a defence instead poured out fire and smoke and confusion. The Alamo scouts, Nellist's men and Ronceville's, were already inside the wire, had been inside or at its edge, and now they moved with the certainty of men working ground they had memorized. The whole assault landed in a single compressed instant. Gate and towers and barracks and pillbox all struck within seconds of one another, so that the enemy never got the chance to fight the raid as a sequence of problems. It arrived as one catastrophe. Inside the cages, the prisoners heard it before they understood it. For 3 years, the sounds that came in the evening had been Japanese sounds. The language of the guards, the routines of the camp, the noises of captivity. What they heard now was different, and it took a moment to comprehend how different. The first thing was explosions. Not voices, not the shouting of guards, but the flat, hard concussions of grenades and the crack of American rifles coming from outside the wire, coming from the darkness beyond the fences where nothing was ever supposed to come from. Men who had learned over 3 years to read every sound of the camp for danger now lay in the barracks listening to a sound they could not place because it belonged to a category they had stopped believing in: rescue. Some of them thought the camp was being bombed. Some thought the guards had finally begun the killing they had all learned to expect after Palawan. Only slowly, as the shape of it resolved, as the explosions moved with the purpose of men and not the randomness of shelling, as the fire concentrated on the towers and the barracks and not on the prisoners' huts, did the truth begin to take hold. The Americans had come. The Americans were here, in the dark, killing the guards. The first prisoner brought out was not one of the crowd in the main compound. Private First Class Leland Provencher of Company C's 1st Platoon came upon a man outside the main group, a generator operator, and it fell to Provencher to make the first contact, to be the first ranger a Cabanatuan prisoner saw, the first American hand laid on a captive to lead him out. It is a small thing set against the scale of what was happening across the compound, and it is also, in its way, the whole thing. One ranger, one prisoner, the machinery of the raid narrowing down to a single man reaching another single man and telling him he was free. Multiply that by 511, and you have the reason the ditches were dug, and the oath was sworn, and the bridge was mined. But the enemy was not finished, and the raid was not without cost. The Japanese in the camp, for all that the assault had overwhelmed them, still had mortars, and in the chaos of those first minutes the mortar fire came down. It fell near the front gate, the very place where the Rangers had breached, where men were moving prisoners out into the open, and it caught them. 6 were wounded in that fire. Among them was Captain James Fisher, the battalion surgeon, the doctor who had marched with them from Guimba and lain in the ditches and was there to keep alive whatever men the raid produced, wounded prisoners and wounded rangers alike. He was hit at the gate, and though everything that could be done for him was done, he would die of his wounds. That the first serious cost of the raid was paid by its physician, by the man whose entire purpose was to prevent death, is one of those bitter arrangements that combat produces and never explains. Fisher had come to save lives. He gave his own in the place where the saving was hardest. The plan and the reality had met, and for once they had matched. The 30 seconds Prince had drawn on paper, the simultaneous breach, the grenades into the barracks before the occupants could respond, the scouts already inside, the towers taken down before they could sweep the ground, had happened almost exactly as designed. It would not always be so. The loud hours would produce their own surprises, their own improvisations, the friction that no plan survives intact. But in the opening instant, the geometry Prince had built held true, and the men who had crawled through cane fields and lain in cold water and run the pattern of doors and towers until it was automatic, executed it the way it had lived in their minds. The stillness was over. The work had begun. Now everything turned on speed, and speed, with 511 ruined men, was the hardest thing of all. The prisoners had to be brought out of the compound and moved south, and most of them could barely stand. 3 years of Bataan and Corregidor and the camp had reduced them to the pathological museum one survivor had called them. Men hollowed by malaria and dysentery and beriberi, men whose legs had forgotten how to carry them, men who wept when told they were free because they no longer had the strength to run toward it. The Rangers went into the barracks and began the extraction that the whole raid had been built to make possible, and it went exactly as the whispered orders had said it would go. The ones who could walk were pointed south and set moving. The ones who could not were picked up. A ranger would sling his rifle, or if he had to, set it down, and gather a prisoner into his arms and carry him, carry a grown man who weighed almost nothing, whose bones showed through his skin, whose arms had no strength left to hold on. Some of the prisoners fought the rescue. Disoriented, terrified, unable to comprehend that the explosions meant deliverance, they resisted the hands that reached for them and had to be coaxed or carried out against their own confused will. The Rangers carried them anyway. No one gets left behind. Mucci had extracted the oath for exactly this moment, and the men kept it man by man, barracks by barracks, until the cages were empty. The column formed on the road and began to move south toward Platero, and it was a strange procession, a river of the barely living flowing out of the dark, some walking, many carried, and the carabao carts Pejota's guerrillas had requisitioned coming forward to take the ones who could not go on foot. Those carts, arranged days before by men who had thought the problem through to its end, now became the difference between a rescue and a stranded crowd of dying men on an open road. The prisoners were loaded into them, and the carts creaked south under their impossible cargo, and the walking wounded shuffled alongside, and the Rangers moved among them, urging, lifting, carrying, counting. 2 of the prisoners did not survive the journey. One died of the illness that had been killing him slowly for months and now finished its work. One died of a heart attack, his body simply failing under the shock of freedom after so long without hope. 2 men, having lived through 3 years of the worst the war could do, died on the road out, within reach of the American lines, within reach of everything they had endured to see. It is a hard fact, and the record does not soften it. 511 came out of the camp. Not all of them lived to reach the other side, and the whole of that fragile column crawling south with its cargo of the dying existed only because the shield held. At the Cabu Bridge, half a mile northeast, Pejota's 200 were doing the thing that made everything else possible. When the firing began at the camp, the Cabu garrison came. The force that could reach the compound in under 4 minutes, the 1,000 men who could have turned the rescue into a massacre. They came down the road toward the bridge, and Pejota's guerrillas met them. The mines went off. The bazooka, in the hands of the man who had learned to fire it that afternoon, found the tanks on the road, and one by one it killed them, 4 tanks stopped by a weapon its operator had held for a matter of hours. The riflemen behind the riverbanks poured fire into the massed enemy trying to force the crossing, and the enemy could not force it. Pajota had promised 15 minutes. His men held for 45. 3 times as long as the plan had asked, through the tanks and the charges and the dark, an unflamboyant man and 200 fighters held a bridge against a force that outnumbered them many times over, and they did not give ground, and they did not withdraw until the signal came at 2200 hours to say that the column was clear and the shield was no longer needed. What they bought with those 45 minutes was the road south, the whole distance between the camp and safety, kept clear of the relief force that would otherwise have fallen on the carabao carts and the shuffling wounded, and ended it all in the open. The cost to the Japanese was severe. In the compound and at the bridge, the enemy dead ran high. The estimates range from something over 500 to figures far larger. The uncertainty a natural product of a battle fought in the dark across a mile of ground, by men with no leisure to count. Against that, the American loss was almost unbelievably small. 2 Rangers were killed. Captain Fisher, the surgeon, died of his wounds, and the raid that had brought 511 men out of captivity had cost, on the American side, a number that could be held in a single hand. Through the night the column moved, and in the morning of the 31st of January it reached American lines near Talavera. The men who came in were a sight the soldiers who received them never forgot. Skeletal figures on carts and on the backs of rangers and staggering along on their own wasted legs, men who had been given up for dead by their own country years before, coming out of the interior of Luzon, on a road held open by Filipino guerrillas, and walked by American rangers who had sworn an oath in a schoolhouse and kept it. The largest rescue of prisoners in American history to that point had been accomplished, and the men who accomplished it were already, most of them, too spent to feel the size of it. But the size of it was never really in the numbers. It was never in the count of enemy dead, or the tally of tanks stopped on the road, or even in the round figure of 511. It was in something smaller, and one image out of the memoirs holds it better than any statistic. Among the prisoners brought out that night was a man so broken by 3 years in the cages that he had lost hold of himself entirely. A man who, when a ranger reached him, could not say who he was, could not produce his own name, the last and most basic possession a human being owns, worn away by hunger and disease and the long erosion of hope. And a ranger looked at him and spoke his name to him, said it aloud, gave it back to him, and in the saying of it the man remembered who he was, remembered that he had been someone before the camp, remembered his own identity as it was handed back across the space between 2 men in the dark. That is what the ditches were dug for. That is what the oath was sworn for, and the bridge mined, and the aircraft flown in its slow feigned dying at 200 feet, and the count made again and again from a shack 300 yards out. All the tactical architecture, the geometry Prince drew, the delay Pajota forced, the pattern Mucci drilled until it was automatic, all of it existed for that single moment, when one man could stand over another and say his name, and give him back to himself, and lead him home. The plan was a problem in geometry. The answer was a man remembering who he was.